September 19, 1940, Warsaw, Poland. SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritzsch stood in the processing room of Pawiak prison, examining the latest batch of Polish prisoners scheduled for transport to Auschwitz. Among the 1,705 men waiting to be loaded onto cattle cars was prisoner number 4859, a man who had given his name as Tomasz Serafiński. Fritzsch barely glanced at him, just another Polish resistance fighter, another enemy of the Reich to be worked to exhaustion in the camps. What Fritzsch didn't know, what no German in that room could have suspected, was that Tomasz Serafiński wasn't this man's real name. His real name was Witold Pilecki. He was a Polish cavalry officer and resistance operative, and he had deliberately gotten himself arrested for one specific purpose: to be sent to Auschwitz. Not as punishment, as a mission. Fritzsch was processing a man who had voluntarily walked into hell, and neither he nor his SS colleagues would discover the truth until it was far too late. By the time they realized what Pilecki had done, he would have built a resistance network inside Auschwitz itself, documented crimes that the world refused to believe, and accomplished something so audacious that even 70 years later, military historians struggle to find a comparable act of courage in modern warfare. But the story of how this happened and what it cost contains twists that would seem unbelievable if they weren't meticulously documented in historical records, personal testimonies, and Pilecki's own reports. Reports that would be suppressed, dismissed, and nearly lost to history, because the truth he revealed was too inconvenient for the powers that had supposedly won the conflict. Witold Pilecki was born on May 13, 1901, in Olonets, Russia, where his family had been exiled by the Tsarist government for Polish independence activities. From birth, he was marked by resistance. His grandfather had fought in the 1863 Polish uprising against Russian rule. His father had been imprisoned for political activities. Pilecki grew up in a family where opposition to occupation wasn't just politics, it was identity. When World War I began, the teenage Pilecki joined Polish independence organizations. By age 17, he was fighting in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921, earning the Silver Cross of the Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest military honor, for valor in combat. He was 20 years old when he received it. He had already seen more combat than most soldiers experience in a lifetime. Between the wars, Pilecki became a reserve cavalry officer, married, had 2 children, and ran a family estate. He founded a cavalry training school and taught horseback riding to local youth. To outside observers, he seemed like a typical Polish landowner, educated, cultured, living a quiet rural life. This was deception. Pilecki was already building networks. The cavalry school was teaching more than horseback riding. It was preparing young Poles for military service. The social connections he cultivated weren't just friendships. They were intelligence assets. By the time Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Pilecki had already transformed himself into exactly what Poland would need: a resistance organizer with military training, social connections, and absolutely no regard for his own safety. When Poland fell in just 35 days, crushed between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia in a coordinated invasion, Pilecki refused to surrender. While the Polish government fled into exile and the army officially ceased to exist, Pilecki and a handful of other officers founded one of the first resistance organizations in occupied Poland, the secret Polish army, Tajna Armia Polska. Here's the first twist that most people don't know. Pilecki wasn't a lone wolf resistance fighter. He was a sophisticated intelligence operative who understood that resistance required organization, not heroics. While other resistance members focused on sabotage and attacks, Pilecki focused on building networks, gathering intelligence, and preparing for long-term operations. He understood something that many resistance fighters didn't. The war wouldn't be won by brave acts of defiance, but by patient accumulation of information and resources. By mid-1940, the Polish resistance had begun receiving disturbing reports about a new German facility near the town of Auschwitz in German. Initially established as a camp for Polish political prisoners, reports indicated it was expanding rapidly. Polish prisoners sent there were never heard from again. Families received death certificates claiming their relatives had succumbed to illness or accidents, but the numbers were impossible. Hundreds of healthy men supposedly passing away within weeks of arrival. The Polish Resistance Command needed to know what was happening inside Auschwitz. They needed intelligence on the camp's layout, guard procedures, weaknesses that could be exploited for sabotage or escape. They needed someone to volunteer to be arrested, sent to Auschwitz, and report back. When Pilecki heard about this mission, he immediately volunteered. His commanders refused. It was clearly a death sentence. No one who entered Auschwitz came out alive. Sending a trained cavalry officer and experienced resistance organizer into a death camp made no strategic sense. Pilecki's response revealed the second twist in this story. He didn't ask for permission again. He simply announced he was going, and if they wouldn't support him officially, he would do it on his own authority. His commanders, recognizing they couldn't stop him, reluctantly approved the mission with one modification. If Pilecki somehow survived and escaped, he would need to provide intelligence reports. If he didn't survive, at least they would know the mission had been attempted. The plan was simple in concept, insane in execution. German forces conducted regular street roundups in Warsaw, arresting random Polish citizens for labor or imprisonment. Pilecki would deliberately walk into one of these roundups, get arrested under a false identity, and hope he was sent to Auschwitz rather than another camp or immediate execution. On September 19, 1940, Pilecki, using forged identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński, deliberately walked to a Warsaw neighborhood where German forces were conducting a roundup. He watched as SS troops surrounded an apartment block. Then he walked directly into the trap. The Germans grabbed him along with roughly 2,000 other men. They were held in Pawiak prison for processing. During the 2-day wait, Pilecki had multiple opportunities to reveal his real identity or attempt escape. He did neither. When the SS announced that prisoners would be transported to Auschwitz, some men panicked. Pilecki felt relief. His plan had worked. The third twist: Pilecki wasn't the only resistance member who had tried this. 2 other Polish operatives had attempted similar missions in early 1940. Neither survived more than 3 weeks in Auschwitz. Their deaths had been confirmed through camp records obtained by resistance members who worked in German administrative offices. Pilecki knew this when he volunteered. He went anyway, believing he could succeed where others had failed. The transport to Auschwitz took 2 days. The men were packed into cattle cars without food, water, or sanitation. Several perished during the journey. When the train arrived at Auschwitz on September 22, 1940, the surviving prisoners were forced to run from the train to the camp entrance, while SS guards beat them with clubs and set dogs on stragglers. Several men were attacked to the point of incapacitation during this initial welcome, Pilecki later wrote in his report. They were beating us over the head with rifle butts and clubs. I received several blows on the head. Blood was flowing down over my eyes and face. The man next to me had his skull crushed. He fell down and was trampled. The prisoners were then forced to stand at attention in the courtyard for hours while SS officers processed them. Anyone who moved or collapsed was beaten or shot. By the end of the first day, 300 of the 1,705 men who had arrived were already gone, attacked, worked to exhaustion, or simply eliminated for arbitrary reasons. Pilecki was assigned number 4859. This number would become legendary in Polish resistance history, though the Germans never knew why prisoner 4859 was different from the thousands of others they processed. What Pilecki found inside Auschwitz was worse than anyone in the resistance had imagined. In September 1940, Auschwitz wasn't yet the industrial elimination facility it would become by 1942. It was something different but equally horrific, a facility designed to destroy prisoners through deliberate brutality, starvation, and impossible labor while maintaining plausible deniability through paperwork claiming deaths from natural causes. Prisoners worked 12 to 14-hour days building the camp's expansion, literally constructing their own prison. They received starvation rations calculated to keep them alive just long enough to be useful. Medical care was non-existent, except for experiments. Camp guards, particularly the capos, prisoners given authority over other prisoners, were encouraged to be as brutal as possible. Violence wasn't just tolerated, it was camp policy. The fourth twist came within Pilecki's first week. He realized that the Polish resistance's intelligence mission, learn the camp layout and procedures, was pointless. There would be no rescue mission, no sabotage operation that could help prisoners from outside. The camp was too well guarded, too isolated, too designed for killing. Any resistance would have to come from inside. So Pilecki changed the mission. Without authorization from outside, without communication with his commanders, operating entirely on his own judgment, he decided he would build a resistance organization inside Auschwitz itself. This decision was borderline insane. He was a prisoner who could be eliminated at any moment for any reason. He had no resources, no weapons, no way to communicate securely. He was surrounded by prisoners who were starving, traumatized, and suspicious of anyone who might be an informant. And he was under constant surveillance by guards who specialized in detecting and crushing any hint of organization among prisoners. Pilecki started carefully. He identified prisoners who showed signs of maintaining their humanity. Men who shared food, helped weaker prisoners, resisted the psychological destruction the camp was designed to inflict. He would work alongside them during labor details, observe them during the brief moments when guards weren't watching, assess their character. When he found someone trustworthy, he would approach them with seemingly innocuous conversation. He would share slightly extra food he had somehow obtained, through trades or thefts Pilecki never fully explained in his reports. He would provide small pieces of hope, information about the outside world, rumors of Allied victories, anything to counteract the despair that destroyed most prisoners within weeks. Then, once trust was established, he would reveal his mission. He was organizing resistance inside the camp, not escape. That was nearly impossible, and would only result in collective punishment for remaining prisoners. Not uprising. They lacked weapons and would be massacred. Instead, intelligence gathering, mutual support networks, and preparation for a potential future uprising if circumstances changed. The fifth twist, Pilecki's first recruit was a man named Słowiaczek, who turned out to be a pre-war Polish army officer, a colonel outranking Pilecki. When Pilecki revealed his mission, Słowiaczek asked who had authorized it. Pilecki admitted no one, he was operating on his own initiative. Słowiaczek's response shocked Pilecki. Good. I wouldn't have joined if you'd been following orders. This place requires improvisation, not bureaucracy. By early 1941, just 4 months after arriving, Pilecki had recruited approximately 100 prisoners into his organization, which he called the Union of Military Organization, Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, or ZAW. The network was structured in cells of 5 men, with only one member of each cell knowing anyone in other cells. This way, if any member was captured and interrogated, they could only reveal 4 other names. The ZAW's activities were subtle but crucial. They stole extra food and distributed it to the weakest prisoners, keeping them alive longer. They forged documents and work assignments to move certain prisoners to better positions. They gathered intelligence on camp procedures, guard schedules, and transportation routes. They maintained morale through whispered news of Allied progress in the conflict. Most importantly, they documented what was happening in Auschwitz. This is where the sixth twist becomes relevant. In early 1941, Auschwitz was still primarily a camp for Polish political prisoners and Soviet POWs. The systematic elimination of Jewish populations hadn't yet begun on an industrial scale. But Pilecki and his network observed the preparations, the construction of additional facilities, the arrival of Zyklon B gas, officially for delousing but in quantities that made no sense for that purpose, the selection processes that sent certain prisoners to new areas from which they never returned. Pilecki understood that something unprecedented was being prepared. He needed to get word to the outside world. The problem: how do you communicate from inside Auschwitz? The answer came from an unexpected source. Some prisoners worked outside the camp on labor details. Others worked in camp offices with limited access to forms and papers. The ZAU began creating a communication system. Messages were written on tiny scraps of paper, hidden inside everyday objects, and smuggled out through prisoners on work details who had brief contact with Polish civilians. These civilians would pass messages to resistance members in nearby towns, who would forward them to Warsaw. It was incredibly dangerous. If caught, the punishment was execution, and not just for the smuggler, but for everyone in their work detail as a deterrent. Yet the system worked. By mid-1941, Pilecki's reports were reaching Polish resistance headquarters in Warsaw. The content of those reports was devastating. Pilecki documented systematic starvation, medical experiments, mass shootings of Soviet POWs, and preparations for something even worse. His reports included specific numbers: how many prisoners had arrived, how many had perished, causes of death, names of SS officers responsible. The seventh twist is perhaps the most bitter. The Polish Resistance Command didn't believe him. The reports seemed too extreme, too systematically cruel to be real. Surely this was exaggeration, trauma-induced paranoia, or German disinformation designed to demoralize the resistance. Some commanders suspected that prisoner 4859 had been compromised and was feeding false information under duress. Pilecki's frustration is evident in later reports, where his language becomes more insistent, more detailed, as if he's desperately trying to convince skeptical readers that yes, this is really happening. He includes witness names, specific dates, guard rosters, anything that might make the reports more credible. But the Resistance Command's skepticism was nothing compared to what happened when Pilecki's reports eventually reached the Polish government in exile in London and, through them, British and American authorities. They dismissed them as propaganda. By late 1941, Pilecki's reports were describing the arrival of the first major transports of Jewish prisoners and the beginning of systematic elimination. He documented the first experimental uses of gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. He provided architectural drawings of the facilities, smuggled out piece by piece through his courier network. The Allied response: this seems exaggerated. Perhaps the camps are harsh, but industrial-scale elimination, impossible. The Germans are brutal, but they're not monsters. This must be resistance propaganda designed to generate sympathy. The eighth twist: Allied intelligence had independent confirmation from other sources, aerial reconnaissance photos, reports from escaped prisoners, intelligence from German defectors, that corroborated everything Pilecki reported. But the scale of what was happening was so unprecedented that analysts couldn't accept it. They had no framework for understanding systematic elimination. It was literally unbelievable. So Pilecki's reports were filed away as unconfirmed, his warnings dismissed as exaggeration, his pleas for action ignored. Inside Auschwitz, Pilecki continued building his network. By 1942, the ZAU had grown to approximately 500 members, a significant organization operating under the noses of SS guards who specialized in crushing resistance. The network now included prisoners in key positions, clerks who could forge documents, capos who could protect other prisoners, work detail supervisors who could redirect supplies. The ZAU even established a primitive hospital system. Several ZAU members worked in the camp infirmary, where they would diagnose healthy prisoners with fake illnesses to get them brief rest from brutal labor. They would steal medicine intended for German staff. They provided mercy to dying prisoners who were suffering, not euthanasia, which Pilecki forbidden, but compassion and pain relief when possible. The ninth twist involves the camp infirmary and reveals Pilecki's moral complexity. One of his key recruits was a prisoner named Daring, a doctor who worked in the infirmary. Daring was invaluable to the Zhao. He saved countless lives through his medical expertise and his willingness to falsify records. After the war, Daring was accused of performing forced sterilizations on prisoners under SS orders. He had been following German orders to save his own life, while also using his position to save others through the Zhao. Was he a collaborator or a resistance hero? Both. Neither. Pilecki never resolved this moral ambiguity in his reports. He noted that Daring saved many lives. He also noted that Daring performed procedures for the SS. Pilecki's conclusion: Auschwitz destroyed normal moral categories. People did terrible things to survive, so they could also do good things. Judgment would have to wait until after the camp was closed. By mid-1942, Pilecki had been in Auschwitz for nearly 2 years. This alone was extraordinary. Most prisoners perished within months. Pilecki had survived through a combination of luck, intelligence, and the support network he had built. Members of the Zhao looked after each other, shared food, warned each other of dangers. But Pilecki was also deteriorating. Years of starvation, brutal labor, and constant stress were taking their toll. He had contracted typhus and survived only because Zhao members in the infirmary had hidden him during recovery. He was losing weight, losing strength. He understood that he couldn't survive indefinitely. More critically, his mission had changed. He had documented the horrors of Auschwitz. He had built a resistance network. But what was the point if the outside world didn't believe his reports or wouldn't act on them? Pilecki made a decision that would result in the 10th twist of this story. He needed to escape, return to Warsaw, and deliver his reports in person. Perhaps if Allied commanders could interrogate him directly, see the evidence he had gathered, hear from someone who had been inside, they would finally believe and act. There was one enormous problem. Escaping from Auschwitz was considered impossible. The camp was surrounded by multiple layers of fencing, watchtowers with searchlights and machine guns, guard dogs and patrols. Beyond that, prisoners who somehow made it outside faced hostile countryside. Poland was under German occupation. Civilians were terrified to help escaped prisoners, and anyone caught helping escapees faced execution. Even if someone made it past all that, they would be dressed in prisoner uniforms with shaved heads, emaciated bodies, and no money or documents. The Germans offered rewards for reporting escaped prisoners and punished Polish civilians who helped them. Of the hundreds who had attempted escape from Auschwitz by early 1943, only a handful succeeded. Most were captured within hours and returned to camp, where they were tortured and executed publicly as a warning to other prisoners. Pilecki spent months planning. He used the Zhao network to gather intelligence on guard schedules, weak points in security, civilian contacts outside who might help. He arranged for civilian clothes to be smuggled into the camp. He forged documents that would allow him to travel once outside. The 11th twist: Pilecki's escape plan relied on a bakery. The camp bakery operated outside the main security perimeter, close enough to be considered part of Auschwitz, but far enough that it required prisoner work details to travel there daily. The bakery supplied bread for both prisoners and SS guards, which meant it had to maintain certain standards and couldn't be completely isolated from Polish civilian workers who delivered flour and other supplies. Pilecki had arranged, through the Zhao network, to be assigned to the bakery work detail. This took months of careful manipulation, bribing capos with stolen goods, forging work assignment papers, ensuring other Zhao members could cover his regular work assignments. By April 1943, he was working at the bakery regularly. The plan was elegant. During the night shift on April 26-27, 1943, when security was slightly relaxed and fewer guards were on duty, Pilecki and 2 other prisoners would cut through the bakery's back fence, change into civilian clothes hidden there by ZOW contacts, and disappear into the Polish countryside before the morning roll call revealed their absence. But here's the 12th twist that nearly destroyed everything. The night before the planned escape, the SS conducted a surprise inspection of the bakery. They found the hidden civilian clothes. The Germans suspected an escape plot. They increased guards and began interrogating prisoners who worked at the bakery. Pilecki should have been caught. The plan should have ended with his torture and execution. Instead, something unexpected happened. One of the ZOW members, a man named Słowiak, claimed the clothes were his and that he had been planning to escape alone. Before Pilecki could intervene, Słowiak confessed to everything, except he claimed he'd been working alone, with no accomplices. The SS believed him. They were used to individual escape attempts. The idea of an organized resistance network inside Auschwitz was still beyond their comprehension. Słowiak was executed the next day in front of assembled prisoners. Before he was taken away, he managed to make eye contact with Pilecki and give the slightest nod. Pilecki later wrote, "Słowiak saved not just the escape plan, but the entire ZOW organization. If the SS had investigated further, they would have uncovered our network. He chose to sacrifice himself to protect hundreds of others. I carried that debt for the rest of my life." The escape had to be postponed while the bakery security was tightened and then gradually relaxed. It took weeks to arrange new civilian clothes, re-establish the route, and wait for security to return to normal levels. Every day of delay meant another day of possible discovery, another roll call where Pilecki might be randomly selected for elimination, another risk that someone would inform on the ZOW. Finally, on the night of April 26-27, 1943, nearly a month after the original date, Pilecki and two companions, Jan Redzai and Edward Ciesielski, made their attempt. During the night shift, while guards were changing positions, they cut through the bakery fence, changed into civilian clothes, and walked calmly away from the camp. They didn't run. Running attracted attention. They walked like Polish workers heading home after a shift. They had forged papers identifying them as Polish laborers. They carried bread from the bakery, both as food and as props to complete their disguise. The 13th twist. They made it less than 3 kilometers before encountering a German patrol. The Germans stopped them, demanded papers. Pilecki, emaciated from years of starvation, his body marked by abuse, tried to explain that he was a Polish worker heading home. The German soldier looked at him suspiciously. Pilecki was certain they were about to be captured. Then the soldier handed back their papers and waved them on. He had noticed Pilecki's condition, but in occupied Poland in 1943, many Polish workers were malnourished and abused. The soldier assumed Pilecki was just another brutalized laborer, not an escaped prisoner. The very evidence of his suffering became his disguise. They walked through the night, hiding during the day, traveling over 100 kilometers to reach a Polish resistance safe house. The journey took several days. They survived on stolen food and help from Polish civilians who, despite the risk, provided shelter and supplies. When Pilecki finally reached Warsaw and made contact with resistance headquarters, his arrival caused confusion. Prisoner 4859 was supposed to have perished in Auschwitz months ago. The resistance had stopped receiving his reports and assumed he was gone. Now he appeared in person, emaciated but alive, with detailed intelligence about Auschwitz and urgent warnings about what was happening there. Pilecki immediately began writing his report. It would eventually exceed 100 pages, detailed descriptions of camp layout, guard procedures, prisoner conditions, the systematic elimination process, names of SS personnel responsible, and documentation of specific crimes with dates and witness accounts. The 14th twist came when Pilecki requested an immediate meeting with Polish government-in-exile representatives and Allied command. He wanted to propose something audacious, an Allied operation to liberate Auschwitz. He believed that with his intelligence about the camp's layout and security procedures, combined with the ZOW network still operating inside, a coordinated assault by Allied forces or Polish resistance could free thousands of prisoners and expose the systematic elimination program to the world. The Polish Resistance Command refused to forward his request. They told him it was impossible. Auschwitz was too well defended. The Allied forces were focused on other priorities. The idea of a rescue mission was fantasy. Pilecki then requested permission to organize a Polish resistance assault on the camp. He would lead it himself, again refused. The resistance couldn't spare the resources, couldn't risk the casualties, couldn't justify the operation when they had so many other missions. The 15th and perhaps most devastating twist. In August 1943, 3 months after Pilecki's escape, his detailed report reached British and American military intelligence through Polish government-in-exile channels. The report included everything: architectural drawings of the gas chambers, detailed descriptions of the elimination process, transport schedules, population statistics, names of victims and perpetrators. The Allied response was documented in now declassified memoranda. They acknowledged the report, but concluded that bombing Auschwitz was not feasible due to the distance from Allied bases and the questionable military value of such a mission. They suggested that the best way to help prisoners was to win the conflict quickly. What the documents don't say, but what historians have pieced together from other sources, Allied command knew Pilecki's reports were accurate. They had corroborating evidence from aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and other sources. They chose not to act because liberating death camps wasn't a military priority. The resources required for such operations were allocated elsewhere. Pilecki's reaction to this rejection isn't fully documented, but his subsequent actions speak clearly. If the Allies wouldn't help prisoners in Auschwitz, he would continue fighting in other ways. In late 1943, Pilecki joined the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, the main Polish resistance organization. He participated in intelligence operations, sabotage missions, and combat operations against German forces in occupied Poland. He trained resistance fighters, organized supply networks, and prepared for an eventual uprising. That uprising came in August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising. The Polish Home Army, believing that Soviet forces approaching Warsaw would support them, launched a coordinated assault to liberate the city before the Soviets arrived. The goal was to establish Polish sovereignty and prevent Poland from simply exchanging one occupation for another. Pilecki fought in the uprising with the same determination he had shown in Auschwitz. For 63 days, approximately 40,000 Polish resistance fighters battled German forces for control of Warsaw. It was urban warfare at its most brutal, building-to-building fighting, civilians caught in crossfire, dwindling supplies. The 16th twist is one of history's great betrayals. Soviet forces, positioned just across the Vistula River from Warsaw, stopped their advance and waited. They watched as German forces systematically destroyed the Polish resistance and the city itself. Stalin had ordered the halt deliberately. He wanted the Polish Home Army destroyed so it couldn't resist Soviet occupation after Germany was defeated. The Warsaw Uprising failed. German forces crushed the resistance with overwhelming force. Approximately 200,000 Polish civilians were eliminated or expelled. The city was systematically destroyed. Hitler ordered that Warsaw be razed to the ground as punishment for the uprising. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found ruins. Pilecki survived the uprising and was taken prisoner by German forces along with thousands of other resistance fighters. Under the Geneva Convention, as a captured combatant in uniform, he should have been treated as a prisoner of war. Instead, the Germans sent captured uprising participants to POW camps in Germany. The 17th twist, Pilecki, the man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz and survived nearly 3 years there, spent the final months of World War II in a German POW camp that was, by comparison, relatively comfortable. He had adequate food, proper shelter, and was treated according to international law. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had survived one of history's most notorious death camps, only to be imprisoned under better conditions afterward. When Allied forces liberated the POW camp in April 1945, Pilecki was free. The conflict in Europe was ending. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Auschwitz had been liberated by Soviet forces in January 1945, and the world was finally seeing the evidence of the systematic elimination program that Pilecki had documented years earlier. Pilecki had survived Auschwitz. He had survived the Warsaw Uprising. He had survived POW captivity. Most people would have considered this the end of the story, a tale of extraordinary survival and heroism, tragic but ultimately triumphant in that he had lived to see the defeat of Nazi Germany. But Pilecki's story was about to take its darkest turn, and it involved not Germans, but the Allies who had supposedly won the conflict. The 18th twist. After liberation, Pilecki faced a choice. Poland was now under Soviet occupation. The communist government being installed by Moscow was arresting former Home Army members as enemies of the people. Many Polish resistance fighters who had fought against Germany were now being imprisoned by their supposed Soviet liberators. Pilecki knew the danger. Friends advised him to stay in the West, to settle in Britain or America where Polish veterans were being welcomed. He had every reason to remain in exile. He had fought courageously, had documentation of his service, and would have been celebrated in the West. Instead, in October 1945, Pilecki returned to Poland. His reason: he believed he could continue serving his country by gathering intelligence on the Soviet occupation. The same instinct that had driven him to volunteer for Auschwitz now drove him to return to danger when he could have remained safe. This decision would cost him his life. The Polish communist regime, backed by Soviet intelligence services, was systematically eliminating former Home Army members. These were people who had fought against Germany and now opposed Soviet occupation. They had the skills, organization and credibility to lead resistance against the new communist government. Pilecki began gathering intelligence on Soviet military positions, communist government operations, and NKVD activities in Poland. He sent reports to Polish government-in-exile representatives in the West. He was essentially doing in Soviet-occupied Poland what he had done in Nazi-occupied Auschwitz, documenting crimes and trying to alert the world. The 19th twist came in May 1947. Pilecki was arrested by the Polish Communist Secret Police, UB Urząd Bezpieczeństwa. He was charged with espionage, collaboration with Western intelligence, and treason against the Polish People's Republic. The charges were absurd. This was a man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz to fight Nazis, who had organized resistance inside a death camp, who had fought in the Warsaw Uprising. Now he was being accused of treason by a government installed by foreign occupation. But the 20th and most horrific twist was still to come. During his interrogation and show trial, the communist prosecutors used Pilecki's Auschwitz mission against him. They claimed he had been a German collaborator, that his survival in Auschwitz proved he had collaborated with SS guards, that his reports were German propaganda designed to discredit the Soviet Union. Think about that. The man who documented the Holocaust was accused of helping create it. The prisoner who built resistance in Auschwitz was called a collaborator. His courage was reframed as treason. The trial was a farce. Pilecki was tortured during interrogation. The same NKVD techniques that the Gestapo had used, now employed by his own countrymen. He was denied effective legal defense. The verdict was predetermined, guilty of all charges. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by a single shot to the back of the head in Mokotów prison in Warsaw. His body was dumped in an unmarked mass grave. His family was not informed of his location, or even allowed to mourn publicly. Under communist rule, being related to Pilecki was dangerous. His widow and children faced discrimination and surveillance for decades. The 21st twist reveals the depth of the communist government's fear of Pilecki's story. All records of his trial were classified. His reports from Auschwitz were confiscated and buried in state archives. His name was removed from official histories of the Polish resistance. For decades, it was effectively illegal to even mention his name in Poland. He had been erased from history. Why? Because Pilecki's story was politically inconvenient for the Soviet-backed government. He had documented Soviet betrayal during the Warsaw Uprising. He had exposed how the Allies had ignored warnings about Auschwitz. He represented the Home Army resistance that opposed both Nazi and Soviet occupation. And most dangerously, he had proved that ordinary people could resist totalitarian systems, first German, then Soviet. The communist regime wanted Poles to believe that resistance was futile, that collaboration with communist rule was the only realistic option. Pilecki's existence, his voluntary entry into Auschwitz, his survival, his continued resistance, contradicted that narrative. So they didn't just imprison him, they executed him, hid his body, classified his records, and tried to erase him from memory. This erasure was remarkably effective. For decades, Pilecki was virtually unknown outside of Poland, and even within Poland, only older generations who remembered the war knew his story. Western historians writing about Auschwitz and the resistance rarely mentioned him. When they did, it was usually a brief footnote about a Polish officer who infiltrated the camp. The 22nd twist. Some of Pilecki's reports and documents survived because copies had been sent to Polish government-in-exile representatives in London before his arrest. These copies sat in archives, mostly unread, for decades. Historians occasionally encountered references to the Auschwitz volunteer, but couldn't verify the details because Polish communist authorities denied the story or claimed it was Western propaganda. It wasn't until 1989, when communist rule in Poland collapsed, that researchers could finally access state archives and piece together what had happened. What they found was staggering: detailed documentation of Pilecki's mission, his reports from Auschwitz, records of his trial and execution, and evidence of the systematic campaign to erase his memory. In 1991, Pilecki's trial was declared invalid and he was posthumously exonerated. In 1995, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of colonel. In 2006, he was posthumously awarded Poland's highest military decoration, the Order of the White Eagle. But perhaps the most significant recognition came in 2013, when Pilecki was finally honored at the site where his story began. Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum created a permanent exhibit about prisoner 4859 and the resistance network he built inside the camp. The 23rd twist emerged from documents discovered during the creation of that exhibit. Pilecki's resistance network, the ZAU, continued operating in Auschwitz even after his escape. Members he had recruited continued their work, supporting prisoners, documenting crimes, maintaining hope, right up until the camp's liberation in January 1945. Some ZAU members survived the camp and testified at post-war trials of SS personnel. The organization Pilecki created outlived his time in the camp by nearly 2 years. Even more remarkably, interrogation records of captured SS guards revealed that German camp authorities had suspected the existence of organized resistance in Auschwitz, but never discovered the extent of the ZAU network. They knew prisoners were somehow communicating with the outside, knew that some prisoners seemed unusually resilient, but they couldn't identify the organization or its leadership structure. Pilecki's cell-based design had protected the network even under the most intensive security regime imaginable. The 24th twist involves the fate of Pilecki's reports. When researchers finally gained full access to British and American intelligence archives in the 2000s, they discovered that Pilecki's reports from Auschwitz had reached the highest levels of Allied command, including detailed reports that were briefed to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US President Franklin Roosevelt. Both leaders had read summaries of what Pilecki documented. Both had been presented with evidence of the systematic elimination program. Both had chosen not to authorize military operations to disrupt the camps, either through bombing or rescue missions. The justification, documented in now declassified memoranda, was consistent. Military resources had to be focused on defeating Germany through conventional warfare. Diverting bombers or troops to attack concentration camps would delay victory and potentially cost more lives than it saved. The best way to help camp prisoners was to win the conflict as quickly as possible. This logic is still debated by historians. Some argue it was pragmatic military necessity. The Allies were fighting a global conflict and had to prioritize. Others argue it was moral failure. How could liberating death camps not be a priority when thousands were being eliminated daily? What's not debated is that Pilecki's warnings were received, understood, and consciously set aside. The man who voluntarily entered Auschwitz, survived nearly 3 years, documented unspeakable crimes, and escaped to deliver his report in person. His warnings were acknowledged and then ignored because acting on them was inconvenient. The 25th twist is deeply personal and comes from documents found in Pilecki's family archives, which were finally accessible after his rehabilitation in the 1990s. His wife, Maria, had kept letters he had written before his execution. In one letter smuggled out of Mokotów prison, Pilecki wrote, "I tried to do my duty as a Polish officer and a human being. I tried to stop the crimes I witnessed. I tried to alert the world. I failed. Not because I lacked courage or determination, but because the world didn't want to hear. Now I face execution not by the Germans I fought, but by those who claim to have liberated Poland. Perhaps this is fitting. I volunteered to enter hell to fight evil. I didn't realize that evil would be waiting for me after I left." The letter was dated May 20th, 1948, 5 days before his execution. Maria hid the letter for decades, fearing that possessing it would endanger her and her children. She finally revealed its existence in 1989 when communist rule ended. But there's a 26th twist that even Maria didn't know until researchers revealed it decades later. Pilecki hadn't been executed immediately after sentencing. According to prison records unsealed in 2003, he was held in his cell for additional weeks while secret police interrogated him about other resistance members and Western intelligence contacts. The interrogation records are partially destroyed, but surviving fragments suggest that Pilecki revealed nothing during this period. Despite torture, despite the certainty of execution, despite having no reason to protect information anymore, he maintained his silence. Even facing certain death, Pilecki refused to compromise his fellow resistance members or provide intelligence that could help the communist regime. When his interrogators finally realized he would never cooperate, they executed him without warning. He was taken from his cell, walked to the prison courtyard, and shot in the back of the head. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. His last words, according to a guard who witnessed the execution, whose account was discovered in Institute of National Remembrance Archives, were, "Long live free Poland." The guard added a detail that makes this even more tragic. After the execution, officers joked about how the Auschwitz spy finally got what he deserved. Even the men executing him believed the propaganda. They thought they were eliminating a traitor, not a hero. Pilecki's body was thrown into a mass grave at Warsaw's Pałąki Cemetery. The exact location was never recorded. When researchers tried to identify his remains for proper burial in the 2010s, they found the mass grave contained dozens of executed political prisoners, and identification was impossible. To this day, Pilecki has no individual grave. His family maintains a symbolic memorial, but his actual remains are unknown and unrecoverable. The 27th twist connects Pilecki's story to the liberation of Auschwitz. When Soviet forces entered the camp on January 27, 1945, they found approximately 7,000 surviving prisoners, those too sick or weak to be evacuated during the German retreat. Soviet intelligence officers interviewed some of these survivors. Multiple survivors mentioned prisoner 4859, or Witold, as the organizer of internal resistance. They credited the resistance network with saving lives, maintaining morale and documenting crimes. Soviet officers took notes on these testimonies, but when Soviet authorities produced their official report on the liberation of Auschwitz, the internal resistance network was barely mentioned. The narrative focused on Soviet forces as liberators, with prisoners cast as passive victims awaiting rescue. The idea that prisoners had organized effective resistance themselves contradicted the Soviet propaganda narrative. Documents discovered in Soviet archives after the USSR's collapse show that Soviet intelligence had identified Pilecki as the resistance organizer and had specifically researched his background. They knew he had been a Home Army officer. They knew he had returned to Poland and was gathering intelligence on Soviet operations. Did Soviet intelligence inform the Polish Communist secret police about Pilecki? Did they help build the case that led to his arrest and execution? The documentary evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Soviet advisors were embedded in Polish security services in this period. Pilecki was arrested in 1947 by a service that worked closely with Soviet intelligence. The charges against him included espionage against the Soviet Union. Whether the Soviets directly ordered Pilecki's elimination or simply encouraged it remains unclear. What is clear is that both Soviet and Polish communist authorities wanted Pilecki silenced, and they succeeded. The 28th and perhaps most profound twist involves the impact of Pilecki's suppressed reports. Historians have calculated that if Allied forces had acted on Pilecki's intelligence in 1943, either bombing the camp's infrastructure or conducting rescue operations, hundreds of thousands of lives might have been saved. The gas chambers he documented were still being constructed in early 1943. Disrupting those operations, even temporarily, could have saved countless individuals. But this calculation assumes that bombing or rescue would have been effective, which is disputed. Some historians argue that bombing would have ended prisoners without necessarily disrupting operations. Others argue that rescue missions would have been impossible given the distance and defenses. What's not disputed is that Pilecki's reports provided the earliest comprehensive documentation of the systematic elimination program. He reported on gas chambers before they were fully operational. He documented transport schedules, selection processes, and disposal methods while they were still evolving. His intelligence was real-time from inside the facility, incredibly detailed, and it was ignored.